Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Now that all these Civ overviews are complete, I thought it'd be nice just for fun to take a step back and look at all the Civ grades at once and just see if anything interesting pops out. Bear in mind, these grades are just my personal opinions based on my own experience and came out between a lot of patches and balance tweaks. They've always been by far the most subjective part of the civilization overviews, and on top of that I feel like I've grown a lot in my perspective and wouldn't necessarily agree with everything I said sometimes up to what's now 4 years ago. In the really early days of the channel, when videos were getting maybe 100 views, I went into them with the mindset that people that clicked on a Mayan or Britain video would want to hear about what the Civ does well, and tried to put every civilization in their best light, which unfortunately contributed to some early inflation with the grades. The Magyar's A+ for Cavalry comes to mind as a clear example of that happening, so just keep that in mind, especially for the older civilizations. Also, before we start, a big thanks to Connor for helping compile all the grades into a single spreadsheet. And speaking of which, here are all of the grades. First of all, you might notice some of the earliest civilizations I covered didn't have them at all, as those videos had a bit different format. So to start, I'll quickly fill in those blank spaces. The next thing is to change a few of the grades that I don't think are accurate anymore, either because they were off to begin with, or the civilization has changed significantly since that overview went out. Persians, for example, deserve an A+ for Cavalry. They have the whole cavalry tech tree plus elephants. I don't know why I originally gave them just an A-, there's really nothing holding them back. The Italian Navy, I'm also moving up from a B+ to an A, while taking their archers down from an A to an A-, since their extra armor no longer applies to skirmishers. There are a few others I'm going to change as well for various reasons, which I'm not going to dive into for the purposes of this video. I know not everyone is going to agree with all of these, but for the moment I'm happy where they're all at. So the next thing is to turn all of these letters into numbers, just applying a simple 1 to 10 scale, which I can then average for each civilization. That boils their entire tech tree down to a single grade. The only awkward part is how to handle the American civilization's cavalry grade, which I decided to omit rather than hit them with a 0. That all said, this now makes it possible to rank the civilizations from highest tech tree average grade to lowest, and here's what we get. Predictably, there are civilizations with a robust tech tree that we'd expect at the top, like Spanish, Byzantines, and Teutons. Mayans and Incas are also quite high, along with jack-of-all-trades civilizations like Malians and Japanese sneaking into the top third. A lot of defensive and monk civilizations are also getting a boost from those points. At the bottom, we have ones I sort of expected, like Khmer, Vietnamese, and Franks, all of which I would say are specialized into just 1 or 2 types of units. The Goths as well make sense to me given they're primarily an infantry-focused civilization. The Huns are the biggest surprise for me at the bottom, but I think their defense and monk ratings are doing a lot to cause that. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't saying that civilizations at the bottom of the list are necessarily bad, but just that their tech tree is relatively restrictive, especially in the Imperial Age. But maybe we can do a bit better than this. After all, some of the ratings are probably more important than others. Monks, for example, I would say are less important to most people than, say, cavalry or siege. The Navy is arguably less important as well, since I'd say land maps outnumber water by a fair margin. Defense and economy can definitely be weighted a lot less as well. If I could do it all again, I'd take out defense and economy as categories entirely and replace them with a trash unit category, but I thought of that idea a little late to really implement it. What I can do now though is make a weighted average to reduce the impact of some of those categories that I think we can all agree are less important than the primary 4. Reorganizing the list by the new weighted average de-emphasizes the defense, monk, and naval contributions, so a civilization like Byzantines of course take a big hit, and civilizations like the Goths jump up a few levels. At the top now we have the Mayans, with Spanish and Mongols close behind. Like I said before, I think the early ratings were a bit inflated, and those were all some of the first civs I covered. At the bottom, the one that's still a surprise to me is the Huns, which I've just given grades for this video specifically, and maybe they're a bit low, but again, might also reflect that Huns are so specialized toward the archery range in stable to the detriment of their barracks and siege workshop. Another little surprise for me is that the Ethiopians didn't do better. I have a very high opinion of that civilization and have a lot of fun playing them, so I would think my subjective rankings would have been a bit more of a factor in bumping them up. Saracens are also maybe a little low, considering how open their tech tree is. It's the same thing for the Chinese, which I think of as comparable to Japanese in terms of their flexibility, so it's odd for them to be so far apart. Just for context though, if I were to say change their archers from an A to an A+, and their siege from a B to a B+, they'd have the same score. So that really emphasizes how close all of these civilizations actually are. Even very subtle adjustments could move the middle third quite a bit. The next thing I'm wondering is, for each category, how do the top civilizations compare with my top 5 Civ ranking series? Starting with the archers, as always, I put Mayans at the top, followed by Magyars, carried by their cavalry archers and extra foot archer line of sight. At this point, I'm not convinced they're anywhere close to a number 2 overall, and seeing this makes it tempting to move Huns, Ethiopians, or Chinese up to a 9 out of 10. You can see how crowded it is near the top with all of the 8s, which represent an A-. I would say a good chunk of civilizations have something cool or unique about their archers, whether it's more range, attack, armor, or a unique unit, so it's pretty busy at the top of the list. Even some of the ones at the bottom, like Vikings or Aztecs, could arguably go higher, since their archers can at times be pretty decent. The biggest determining factors here were thumb ring, bracer, and of course having arbalest or not. I always found cavalry archers were hard to consider here, since you really need them with thumb ring, bloodlines, and Parthian tactics to get the most out of them. It's tough with something like the Goths, where they have heavy cavalry archers but no thumb ring. Is that really something that helps their archery range, or should it be ignored entirely? It's a pretty subjective call. You also get civilizations like the Khmer that have everything except thumb ring, and still end up near the bottom of the list. It doesn't look like a bottom 6 tech tree, but in the context of playing them, they're just behind so many other civilizations. Moving on to infantry, the top of the list is, of course, the Goths, with Slavs, Japanese, and Malay up there as well. All of that looks exactly right to me, and it's interesting that there's also a lot more spread in this one than with the archers. Part of that is the infantry choices are so much more restricted that even missing one unit like the champion or halberdier can automatically throw them down to a B- at best. Again, Khmer are at the bottom because of 3 missing techs, and Turks have to be down there as well. To me, a B+ meant that you had the full tech tree, and a B means you have the full tech tree minus one of the barracks techs like tracking or squires. I feel like I was more consistent about infantry grades overall, with basically a small bonus moving them up to an A-, and a large bonus or a strong unique unit moving them up to an A. Out of all of them, Malay were probably the weirdest one to try to put a number to, just because they're missing champion, but also have the goldless two-handed swordsman. I gave them an A just because of how good their infantry tended to feel when actually playing games, so grades were sometimes influenced by how they work in practice, as opposed to just counting up how many crossed out techs they have. Moving on to cavalry, I would say the top of the list looks about right to me. The Berbers were number 1 on my cavalry list because of their discount bonus. They win in cost efficiency tests against everyone, so I felt like they had to go first on that list, but I still don't know if they're actually an A+ here without paladins, and if scenario tests have been over-exaggerating their discount bonus. I'm a bit conflicted over where they stand and how to reconcile it with the top 5 list, but I like their tech tree at just an A grade. Paladins were obviously a big consideration from a tech tree perspective. The Paladin led to some tough questions though when it didn't come with bloodlines. Byzantines and Celts, for instance, end up in the middle just because I consider the Night Rush so important, and it really needs bloodlines to be good in my opinion. If you consider which civilizations have bloodlines and how it correlates on the list, you get a sense of how important I think it is for cavalry civilizations. I really consider it one of the best value and most important techs in the game. The Teutons were also an interesting case, having no light cavalry or husbandry, but at the same time paladins. Then there's the difficulty in balancing camels as well, which as you can see on the list are correlated with higher grades, versus the battle elephant, which have not generally been part of a strong stable. Moving on to siege, this category was probably the least impacted by economy bonuses, so it really just became a question of how much they had available. Essentially, every civilization tends to be missing something, but no one is missing everything. That's reflected in a C+ being the lowest grade handed out. I think the Huns are a good example of that, who are stuck with mangonels, but also have the siege ram and good trebuchets to offset that. It's only every once in a while that you'll have a civilization with a great bonus that makes them undeniably good, like Celts or Mongols. Other bottom-tier siege civilizations without siege engineers also have redeeming qualities though, like the Magyars with a decent selection, or Italians with their discounted bombard cannons. Moving on, the navy, defenses, and economy were always a bit less important to me, but here are the rankings. It was always hard to balance things like an early wood bonus with having shipwright or not, even with an early and late game grade, which I often averaged. I would at least generally agree with them at the top of the list, though I base my opinions on just a handful of water maps played with each of them, and I wouldn't strongly argue against anyone who had an issue with the specific grades. With defenses, I was basically looking at their university, including towers and building HP techs. I still feel like there are key counter units like hand cannoneers and quickly created unique units that contribute to being able to defend map control, and tried to consider those as well. Looking at the list, I'd again say I agree with most of what's near the top. For anybody who says I grade the Japanese too high, look at this. Even with their amazing towers, I still have them right in the middle. What can I say, they're still underrated, even by me. And finally, with the economy, I'd say I agree with the top 5. The Slavs may not have deserved a top grade when the overview first came out, but with the new patch, their farming has been substantially improved and feel right up there with the best. Economy bonuses were factored into other grades as well, so arguably this didn't need to be its own category, but it's still nice to acknowledge that outside of a wide tech tree, sometimes a civilization has a lot of flexibility solely from the fact that they have so many extra resources early on to work with. So those are all the tech tree grades. There are, of course, going to be inconsistencies, but overall, at least the highest and lowest rankings tend to be results I still agree with. Of course, civilization choice isn't everything, and over the long run, player skill is always the determining factor, but if the success of the overview series is anything to go by, there's a lot of entertainment value in learning the different playstyles and strengths of each civilization. The myriad of potential combinations is definitely a contributor, in my opinion, to the game's longevity. In even just a 1 vs 1 game, there are almost 500 possible matchups, and in a 2 vs 2, there are over 30,000 combinations. For me though, the choice is clear. Japanese never let me down. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.